Common Knowledge is brought to you by PureMTGO.com and InkedGaming.com. Use coupon code CCMTG10 at checkout for a 10% discount on all Inked Gaming supplies and accessories. You can support the show directly through Patreon at patreon.com/common knowledge.
This is Common Knowledge, a Magic the Gathering podcast about improving at the game with a focus on pauper play. It's not about the cost, it's about the knowledge. Welcome to Common Knowledge. Here are your hosts, Brandon Clark and Lobbert. Enjoy this week's episode of Common Knowledge.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Common Knowledge Commonomina. I'm your host, Brandon.
Well done.
Joined with me is Lobbert. This is episode 38 of the Common Knowledge podcast.
How's everybody? Second time, right?
Yeah, for the second time. Yeah. I'll let you explain why for the second time.
I downloaded a soundboard and I messed up my audio, how I had to set up my audio drivers, and I didn't record any of Brandon's audio. So I only had the best parts of the episode.
Yeah, I was about to say, to be fair, it's probably listenable now.
No, I mean, there's parts that I'm glad we get to redo.
Yeah, it's like we got to do a practice run, and now we get to give you guys the final product, because I think this is actually a really cool episode that we've got, and I really want the listeners to hear this information.
I do. It's kind of thick, so like it's
with
not
two C's.
Thick. Having a second run through where we can get the ideas kind of more streamlined. It's not like thick as in like it's going to be super long episode. It's just really dense. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, dense with two C's.
Dense.
Yeah, this episode is just going to be just jam-packed with a lot of information. There's just kind of a lot to it, but I guess I haven't said what it is. We know what it is because we've recorded this episode before, but the listeners don't. So this episode is part 1 in our ever-ongoing segment about brewing, where we will deliver a topic about brewing decks, and we don't really have a specific format or for how often we're going to do these episodes or when, but it's just when we come up with a great idea that we want about brewing, we're going to do an episode about brewing. So this first one is about card numbers, as in how many of a card do I want in my deck? Is this a 4 of? Is this a 1 of? Is this a 3 of? Is this a 2 of? Is this a no of?
No of.
Yeah, we're actually not going to go into no ofs because we're not talking about card selection. We're actually just talking about, like, Sean pulled out the hypergeometric calculator and did a bunch of stuff that confused me, and we're going to look at the percentages of, if I have 3 in this deck, my percentage to draw it is X by X turn, that sort of stuff. So if you're a math junkie, buckle up, because this is going to be a fun ride, and for the rest of you, buckle up, because it's going to be a bumpy ride. But first, let's get into our what are we playing?
What are we playing?
I'll start it off. I've been playing elves for the last couple weeks. I have a theory, a hypothesis. I think that elves just might secretly be the best deck in this format, and that might not be a secret to people like the Maverick Girl and those other people who've been dominating with this deck, but this deck just seems really powerful. It's incredibly fast, it's incredibly consistent, and it's incredibly powerful. And for a really long time, I just kind of thought that, like, I don't know that I want to play a deck that when Electrickery is so prominent in the format. And the more I play it, and the more I've played against it, the more I'm just realizing that Electrickery is not that great against the deck. I mean, it's good, but it's not like, oh, I resolved an Electrickery, so now this game is just going to be a basically a stroll, to the
Yeah.
end line, which is sort of the preconceived notion that I had, and I think that just came from lack of experience against actually playing with it. I've only played against it a few times, and I think those few times I played against it, my opponents just got really unlucky draws, and like they just kind of drew into a way that was really good against or really bad when they got Electricaried. But there are a lot of ways that this deck can get around Electricary, especially from my point of view when I was playing Delver decks. Where the Delver deck struggles to get a red mana by like turn 3. Like I would say that ideally, like that's probably where you realistically have an untapped red source is like turn 3 or turn 4. And by then, the elf deck has just like put a couple Timberwatch elves into play. Their Elvish Vanguard is a 3/3 or bigger than Electricary, and there's just too many threats to manage.
Yeah, the Electricary I feel like just is a good tempo play in getting rid of all of the mana producers.
Yeah.
And resetting Lissalana Huntmaster, all of their tokens.
Yeah. And the way I was seeing it for a long time was that Electricary was your end game, and I can hold this for a couple more turns and that's just going to get them. But that's not the truth. Like your Electricary, you've got to get it off like on turn 2 or 3, like as quickly as you can. Like even if you're only getting like a couple mana creatures, I will trade my Electricary for 2 mana creatures any time of the day against this elf deck, just because that's really how they, you want to use your Electricary to get those mana creatures off the board, so that on their 3rd turn they only have access to 3 mana instead of 6.
If 3, like
yeah,
if they're on the 3 forest draw, wow.
Yeah, that's true too. Like they could just maybe only have 1 or 2 lands. They could be constrained to 1 or 2 mana, but if you wait and hold on to that Electricary to try to get more value, they're going to have access to 6 mana, maybe even more if they had like a Curian Ranger, Priest of Titania draw. They could have upwards of, I don't know, 10 mana, something like that on turn 3. And at that point, the threats they're playing are just not manageable with Electricary alone. And you only have 1 red source if you're a Delver player. If you're, playing like Boros Monarch or something else, it's probably a little easier to manage because you can have access to 2 or 3 red sources at a time. But it still just gets out of control really fast.
Yeah, it goes right along with your philosophy of playing a deck that just has a good way to close the door and has a good game plan of like, this is what I'm doing. I play elves and they win. Like I have seen elves dirtle, but it's usually because of interaction. It's not because they're just not doing anything themselves, right?
Yeah, I played a game against Skred Delver where the Skred Delver player drew all 4 of their Skreds, 2 Lightning Bolts, and Electricary, and a Swirling Sandstorm in their game 2, and I still won that game. It was just about making my early turns as good against Electricary as I possibly could, like only putting out 1 or 2 creatures that could get removed by it, kind of being a little slower with my development, forcing him into a position where he had to react to what I did, and then deploying another threat, or making him spend mana, and then all of a sudden he's tapped down and I can cast Lead the Stampede and refill. So I think the deck is really, really good, and I feel silly that I've kind of dismissed it for so long. Like I knew the deck was great, but I just kind of always assumed it was, it was below those other decks that were in the top of our power rankings. And so I'm curious to play the deck more and start to try and understand why that deck isn't doing better in challenges. Like, is it just not being played? Or I don't know, because from the limited amount of experience I've had playing it and from playing against it a bunch, I just think the deck is incredible.
How many games against Kuldetha Boros, or not Kuldetha Boros, Boros Monarch?
Boros Monarch. I honestly haven't played any. I would imagine that that's one of my worst matchups, but
that might be one of the reasons.
Yeah, I also think that deck is like on the downtick too. I don't play against it often. I honestly haven't played against it in probably a month, and that could obviously just be down to variance too, with the way you're paired in leagues. I don't know if there's an algorithm or what, but
I think our previous power rankings, like, we are seeing that deck go down and down and down.
Yeah,
it's still like top-ish of the format. Like, I think it's like number 5 right now, and I don't know what it's gonna do next month. But
yeah, I'll be curious.
But yeah, Elves is gaining momentum. I like where it's at.
Yeah, I think the deck's really solid, and I've been having a lot of fun playing it and learning it. It's been nice to kind of change pace. So, what have you been playing?
Since this encompasses 2 weeks, it's all over the place. Mostly it's been my red mid-range deck and my mud deck. I did record a league with my mud deck, and that deck was totally designed for a different meta. And there's been a couple of cards printed even since I updated the deck list. Peace Strider being the biggest one. I had that in the board, and it came in every game almost. And it's pretty interesting. I don't even know whether I want to post that video. I think I will, but I kind of want to post one right after to be like, no, it's better than this. But other than that, I've been playing my red mid-range deck, which also has improved a lot. I'm excited to see how that does against decks that are like real and not like tournament practice decks. But it's got some major power as long as you don't play against hexproof.
Okay. Is it just the life gain that comes with hexproof that you can't beat?
It's just the stone never interacting with their creatures.
Sure.
And heroic. Both of those are like not good matchups. I've actually won against heroic like once.
I would guess that was a draw that didn't involve the Trailblazer.
Actually, he played at turn 1 both games. I just had Flame Slash. And then I think he ended up like later getting like 11 toughness Trailblazer, and it was just like, all right, Flame Slash, Bolt, Fire Blast, Ping, and they were just like, yeah, I guess.
Wow.
Yeah, it took my whole hand, and then I kind of just like stabilized. And
what is your primary win condition in that deck again?
Avarax.
Oh, Avarax. That's right. I remember playing
the 5-mana, the 5-mana 3/3 with haste that looks for another Avarax when you enter.
Because you don't have a lot of actual burn in the deck, because you've got a lot of like Flame Slash stuff. Mostly you're trying to deal with creatures, not burn their face.
Yeah, that's where I send all of them, but like it does run Lightning Bolt, Curse of the Pierced Heart, and like Rolling Thunder. Oh, and like Firebolt. Like most of the burn can be pointed at their face. It just doesn't. But if I ever need to like get there, or I'm like way ahead on cards, mostly I'm attacking. Like,
yeah. So is Fire Blast in your deck?
No, it's not.
No? Okay. I think you said Fire Blast when you were talking about killing the 11 toughness thing. But you meant Firebolt?
Firebolt, yeah.
Oh, okay, maybe I just heard Fire Blast.
Your brain's probably correcting and being like, well, he's probably playing the good card.
Well, when you said Fire Blast, I was kind of surprised. I was like, that doesn't make a lot of sense in your deck.
Nah, it doesn't at all.
Okay, yeah. Well,
anyway,
cool.
You want to go on to the card of the week?
Yeah, let's do it.
Card of the week.
So we're going to do something a little bit different. And I think it worked a lot better when this was last week, because I think our set review will be next week's episode. I've got to look at the schedule for sure and make sure the full spoiler list is out. But I'm pretty sure the full spoiler will be out by the time we record next week. So, but anyway, we chose Hypothesizzle as our card of the week, which is a little different because we've never done a card that's in spoiler before as card of the week. But this card has generated a lot of buzz. People were talking about it on the Facebook page, and we just thought it would be a cool card to talk about briefly. We can go a little more in depth on it than we will be able to in our set review, and so that's why we chose to talk about it.
We get 2 spoiler episodes.
Oh, so I don't know. First thing I want to say about this card is I think this card is very interesting and unique, but this is not a Mole Drifter. So let's just get that out of the way right now. Trying to compare it to Mole Drifter or put it in the same camp, I think, is silly. they do two very different things in the decks that would want them, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you just want to go ahead and read what this card does, and then we'll just jump into the explanations?
So Hypothesizel is 3 blue-red, so it's 5 converted for an instant speed spell. It says, draw 2 cards. You may discard a non-land card. When you do, Hypothesizel deals 4 damage to target creature, and it's an instant.
So this card is, well, first off the bat, you draw 2 cards, and then you're given the option to discard a non-land card. And doing so lets Hypothesizel deal 4 damage to target creature. So, this card is kind of a draw engine, and it's also a removal spell. So effectively, it is a 2-for-1, even though you're discarding a card. It replaces itself with a card, and then the card you're discarding basically just turns it into it's the way I see it is, you maybe don't know these cards, but there was a cycle of cards from the Kaladesh block that was like, cast this spell, do an effect, cast a card with less CMC from your hand.
Oh, I know the blue one.
Yeah, and so that's sort of what I think about when I see this Hypothesizel. Like, on its face, this is 5 mana, draw a card, then cast another spell from your hand, but the spell you're always casting is Flame Slash.
Yeah.
Is sort of what I think about when I see this card. My biggest problem with this card is you don't have the option to discard a non-land card. I think it would be cool if it said discard a card. If that card is not a land, have this effect.
And you're always discarding it?
And then you always have to discard a card, but if you decide to discard a land, you don't get the 4 damage. I think that would make that card this card a little more interesting. Maybe a little
worse.
Better. Do you think it would make it worse?
If you only have lands or whatever, Hypothesizel just lets them stay in your hand. If it's not, then you're just throwing away a card, and that doesn't make it any better, even if the card is a land.
I guess that's true.
One thing I think about when I'm playing, I want to play this card, is it kind of lets you put cards that you don't really want in your deck, maybe at later phases of the game, in your deck. So like Mana Leak. Mana Leak is great early, terrible late, and Hypothesizel can just turn that into like a Flame Slash at instant speed. Obviously, you're going to want to play a lot of instants in a deck like this. Like,
yeah,
it's kind of like I'm going to let your spell resolve. I'm going to keep my counter spell. I had the option to cast it though, and then I'm just going to cast Hypothesizel and discard the worst card in my hand to deal with your threat, which I think all that is pretty cool. It's not Mole Drifter though.
No. I don't think it's on the same power level as Mole Drifter, certainly, but I think that inherently they're also just different cards. They fill different spaces within a deck.
Yeah, like Hypothesizel can deal with something immediately and also just be that same, like not the same level of card advantage. I think it is less because it doesn't come with the 2/2 body.
Yeah.
It's not a win con, so you have to have other win cons in your deck. But I can see why people would make the comparison. They have blue in their casting cost, they cost 5, and they draw 2. That's all of the similarities. What actually the card ends up doing is completely different.
So is Tidings as good as Mole Drifter?
What's
3/2 blue sorcery, draw 3 cards. Or it's draw 4 cards? I think it's just draw 3 cards. That card must be better than Mole Drifter because you draw a 3rd card, right? And it's blue. And it says draw cards in the name?
Well, it says draw 4 cards.
Well, wow, that card's twice as good as Mole Drifter.
It depends on what you're doing, but I think the fact that it does, like, the fact that Mole Drifter comes with a body, like, I don't know.
Yeah,
I think if Tidings was
be...
Pauper, that people might play that over it. Maybe.
Yeah, I don't think it can be understated enough how relevant the 2/2 body on Mole Drifter actually is in this format. But anyway, should we talk for a minute about possible deck applications for this card?
Yeah, that sounds fun.
Yeah, I think the most obvious inclusion for this card is the Pieces of the Puzzle deck.
Mm-hmm.
This is a hit off Pieces of the Puzzle. It gets you deeper into your own deck. It sort of just goes along with the entire game plan of that deck, and it provides a removal spell.
I think that the card Pieces of the Puzzle is flawed. I actually don't like Pieces of the Puzzle, the card. I
Hmm.
think it, like, you don't really want to play it turn 3. I don't want to play it turn 3. And then I want to leave up a counterspell most of the time in that deck.
Yeah. The way I envision, I've never played the deck, but the way I see Pieces of the Puzzle is, when you're out of gas, you can refill with pieces and still have mana up to use one of the spells that you found. I don't like the idea of using pieces on turn 3 just because you don't really know what you're wanting to grab. I would just think I would rather have more information about where the game state is at, and just it would just make my choices better. I can look at all those options and go, well, I definitely don't need this counterspell right now. I have to answer these threats on board, so I'm going to grab a removal spell or two or whatever.
Yeah.
I think having Hypothesis in your deck slightly changes that, just because this is such a solid late game draw spell that also is a removal spell. But I still think that you probably aren't casting Pieces of the Puzzle on turn 3 very often.
That deck list is kind of weird. I think it would run Hypothesis, but I don't know. Like, it's tough to say what comes out, and like, they're probably playing 1 or 2 of these max.
Yeah, I don't think it's a 4 of at any stretch, but probably like a 1 or a 2 of seems right. I think that's just the most obvious place where this card can go. Some people have brought up Tron, and I just don't.
Okay.
I just don't really know that this is good enough for Tron. I just feel like, I don't know. Those deck lists are pretty tight.
As like a teachings target, though, that feels kind of cool. Just being able to teachings for a Hypothesis, and then
I guess that's true.
Draw to discard a Moment's Piece, or
yeah, I guess that is true. One of the other big flaws of this card, or what I don't like about this card, is that within blue and red, there's not a lot of cards that I'm excited about discarding. And so really all you're getting is a Flame Slash, whereas I want to discard an edict. What's that edict called?
Chainers.
There's so many. They're so dumb that they have all these different cards with edict in the name. It confuses me.
Yeah, same with Tutor, but
the flashback edict. But at least with the tutors, like, they're different in a way, Like, all the edicts are 2 mana, and then it's like, okay, the edict with flashback. But anyway, like, I think about like discarding Chainer's Edict to this card and getting a Flame Slash out of it, and then I have an edict that I can flashback later, But like, I also just don't want to play a Grixis deck. I think
Tron
that
doesn't.
But
care
Tron,
so much,
Tron doesn't care about that, so it's not necessarily a drawback for them to have all these different color constraints in their deck.
And thinking about like mnemonic walling this back, like casting mnemonic wall, getting it back. That feels like the game's over, but I want to play this with a Goblin Electromancer. That's what I plan on doing. I
think that would be cool.
I've kind of found that Goblin Electromancer with an Apostle's Blessing is a really good turn 2 play, and then turn 3, even if you play your Electromancer then, and then you can like prohibit for 1 mana, and it reduces the kicker and stuff. Like, that's been really fun when I've been trying it out. And as a top end that I can draw more and remove something, Hypothesis is kind of what I'm looking for, because I don't want to put Muldrifter in that deck, but Hypothesis I'm thinking about as like a 1 of.
Yeah, I do think, though, that if this card can find a home, I think it'd probably be in the Piece of the Puzzle deck, possibly in the Tron deck. I don't really know, but I think that if it does really find a good home, it's going to be in some sort of brew. And I guess the question is just, is this a powerful enough card that it could power a new archetype, so to say? And I just don't really know offhand.
Every time we do our power rankings, there's at least one deck that's just like blue, red, like, I don't know what this is. Just like blue, red
that's
Flicker,
true.
blue, red Control, and maybe we have Thunderous Wraths in there.
That's true. This card is definitely better than Thunderous Wrath.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of excited about this card. I think it's a really cool card. I don't think it's as good as a lot of people have said it is, but I think it's interesting, and it's got some space to work with. So
I think great addition to the format is the best thing you can say about this.
yeah, it might not make an impact, but I think it's opening up a new realm of deck space that I don't know that has been really explored before.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the idea of Goblin Electromancer in this format. I've been really excited about your Goblin Electromancer brew ever since you showed it to me, and I think that just having Goblin Electromancer to power out these big spells is a really interesting idea and concept. And I think that this card would be fun to cast for 4 mana.
Yeah, Hypothesis is decent at 5, but it's really good at 3.
Yeah. Well, I don't really have anything else to say about this card.
All right.
It's not Mole Drifter.
Main topic.
So, like we said, this week we're doing a brewing topic, and we're doing the number of cards that you should put in your deck. And this isn't like, it should always be 60 at end of show. But we're talking about the number of a specific card you should put in your deck.
Shouldn't
like
always be
Lightning Bolt.
60.
Usually.
I think in Pauper it should probably always be 60, but there was
Unless you're Mikey Ruru.
This is super. I don't know who that is, but this is super off topic. But somebody top 8 at a GP, and they may have won. I think they got second place and lost to Reed Duke or something. But it was standard when Siege Rhino was in the format, so it was that standard format. But they played a 64 card deck, and Mike Flores was talking about it on his podcast, and he was just like, "This is insanity." And Patrick Chapin was like, "Or is this genius?" And I guess some of the pros, had looked at the numbers and had thought about it, and Patrick Chapin was like, "It's not often correct, but I think this time playing more than 60 cards was correct and was a very good decision."
Why?
I can't remember all his reasonings, but
that's the most interesting part.
Yeah. Well, this was Siege Rhino Standard was 2 or 3 years ago. And I didn't play that standard. I just remember I listened to that podcast at that time. But
I
anyway,
can't think of any good ones. But
that's all I can remember was that the numbers were correct on it. Anyway.
So this topic was suggested by Grail Games on Twitter. He just said, when should I run 2 cards versus 3 cards of a specific card in my deck? And I gave him kind of a short answer, but I promised that we would do a whole episode on it because I think this is a really good idea for an episode topic. This is going to be kind of math heavy, so if all of the numbers go over your head, you can just kind of glaze over and just listen to the parts where we're actually talking about real words.
Yeah, all the numbers are probably going to go over my head, so don't feel bad, listeners.
What you use to determine probability in Magic is something called a hypergeometric calculator. And there's plenty of articles and videos on how to use one of these, and they're just used for calculating probability. The reason you can't just do it by hand, unless you're some kind of math god, is every time you draw a card, you're removing the probability that it will be drawn and kind of increasing the probability of everything else being drawn. So it's it's 1 out of 59, and then you draw another card. It's 1 out of 58. And so it gets pretty complicated. Just Google a hypergeometric calculator. And if you don't know how to use one, I'd say Google it. It's just 5 fields. If you can probably figure out what they are. But anyway, all of our statistics were done with a 7-card hand on the play. So you don't get that extra card. And that's, if you get the extra card, it's going to increase all of the chances of everything. So are you ready to go into 4 through 1?
Yeah, let's do it. I am curious, though, how many people, when you said math god, in their head sang that Eminem song, Rap God, but replaced rap with math, because I did.
Yeah, I did too.
I wonder if Frank Karsten sings that to himself all the time.
I said math god, and then in my head I was just like, math god. And then I kept going.
Exactly what I did. goodness. All right. Well, let's start with the basics. So the first is four of. So typically, four of is a card that you want in your deck as you want to see it every single game as early as possible and as frequently as possible. So based off a 7-card hand, when you have 4 copies of a card, you have a 40% chance to see at least one in your opening 7, which that's pretty good odds. By turn 4, you have a 53% chance of seeing at least one. And by turn 4, you have a 13% chance of seeing multiples.
So you really have to be okay with seeing more than one of these cards. Otherwise, you kind of might as well put something else that's going to be more useful if you have one of one and then one of the other.
Yeah.
And I've had it be where I make a deck list and I come up and I'm like, well, this is 28 cards. And that's all of the 4 ofs I want to put in my deck. And then I look at all my 1 or 2 ofs and I'm like, this doesn't make a whole deck. And I just jam stuff that doesn't make, it doesn't synergize, but it's like, oh, that's a good card. And those usually end up being my worst brews. I feel like the number of 4 ofs that you just automatically get is kind of a determiner for what's playable.
Yeah.
Let's move on to 3 copies of a card, so that we have some kind of context to go off of when we're comparing the four cards.
Okay.
So you want 3 copies of a card when the second copy still isn't a dead card, but you don't want it in your opening hand. So these end up being usually some of your more expensive plays or a little bit more niche, but you still want them kind of cards. So in your opening 7, you have a 32% chance of seeing one. So that's roughly a third. So a third of games, you're going to see one of these in your opener. And then by turn 4, there's a 43% chance of seeing one. And by turn 4, there's also a 7% chance of seeing multiples. So we've cut the chance of seeing duplicates in half, but our chance of getting the card is still pretty high. So you got to want this card and you don't want multiples. That's the biggest thing, I think, when you're dropping from 4 to 3.
And then 2 copies of a card in your hand. These are typically, again, cards that you don't want in your opening hand, or they're not super vital, or just really a card that you only want to see in the mid to late stages of the game, and that sort of has diminishing returns in multiples. And so you've got a 22% chance to get one in your opening hand. There's by turn 4, 30% chance to see at least one, and 3% chance to see 2 by turn 4. So those numbers have dropped quite drastically from 3 to 2, and especially from 4 to 2.
Yeah, the chance of seeing a duplicate has from 4. We've cut that number. It's a quarter of what it was, and it's still half of what it was for 3 cards. So I think the biggest thing when I'm choosing how many cards to put in my deck of a certain kind is, do I want to see multiples of this? I think that's like Prismatic Strands. Prismatic Strands, I honestly want to see all the time, but I don't want multiples of that card. It's just not, it doesn't do anything in multiples. In fact, having 1 in your hand is kind of like having 2 in your hand, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much.
I think the most I've ever seen in a deck of Prismatic Strands is 2, and then maybe more on the board.
Yeah, and I think 2 makes a lot of sense when it comes to Prismatic Strands, because that is like having 4 copies. And there's going to be a lot of matchups where you never want to draw your Prismatic Strands, and so 2 is a decent number. There's a good chance that I just don't draw Prismatic Strands, but in the matchups where you really want a Prismatic Strands, you're not going to complain if you draw 2 of them that game.
Yeah, and it's a card that I feel like is just so strong that honestly I don't even want to put 2 in my deck for the redundancy reason, but it's so strong that you just want the chance of you drawing any of them to be that much higher, so that you can block and then Prismatic Strands and just blow people out.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and so the next point is just a one of. So this is a card that you really only want to see once in a game. You never want to draw it in multiples. Like, it just has really diminishing returns in multiples. Or it's a card that's just niche enough that you don't necessarily need it in every matchup, but there's a few matchups where it's great and a few matchups where it's very underwhelming. That's where your one-ofs come in. And so there's a 12% chance to see a one-of in your opener, which I still don't think is very low.
Surprisingly, no.
Like, a 1 out of 10 chance to see that card is a little higher than 1 out of 10 chance,
1 in 9, right? Yeah.
Yeah. By turn 4, you have a 17% chance of seeing one. So, and obviously you have a 0% chance of seeing it in multiples. But
which is like one of the most important things, right? Like,
yeah, that's the reason you're probably playing a one of, is you never want to draw it as a one of. And I don't know, maybe there's certain matchups where you would love to get multiples of this card, but that's where sideboards come into play, I would think. So
yeah, definitely. And I feel like this might be off topic, but I'm just kind of curious what you think. So I've kind of had this philosophy that I've played around with ever since I started really getting into Magic. And it's kind of the idea that, and it goes completely contrary to normal deck building ideas. A perfect deck list would be a singleton deck list.
So you think Commander is perfect Magic? You said it, not me.
No.
Your words.
The reason you could never build that deck, I feel like, is because there's not enough unique effects that you want like that. But
yeah.
Okay, this card I draw, I just win against this deck. This card I draw, I just win against this deck. Like, they're all unique effects that are so, like, super powerful, but in multiples they're useless. Like, Crucible of Worlds is a non-pauper example. Putting one Crucible of Worlds in your deck kind of makes it so you've got ramp forever as long as you have lands in your deck and fetch lands or something like that. But in multiples, it literally does nothing. So if you had a complete 60 cards of each of these does something equally as powerful, but in multiples they're not as good, I think that would be like the sweetest deck list. The problem I have with like
doesn't that just make your deck wildly inconsistent at doing anything?
Yes, but it makes it really good at a bunch of things. That's why I think it doesn't actually hold up when you're actually brewing, because you want to add consistency and things like that.
Yeah.
And those cards don't actually exist in those numbers. They're good as like splash cards.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe Legacy's more of a format to support something like that.
Yeah, but that's because they're playing 4 Brainstorms and 4 Ponders, so they can have more one-ofs.
That's true, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and
yeah,
or they have
I
Hypothesizal, and they can just discard the ones that don't matter.
They're one-of Hypothesizal that they have to draw in order to make the dead card in the matchup not a dead card.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about this theory.
Okay.
It I don't know. Maybe this is just beyond my thinking, but this doesn't make sense to me.
It's just because the idea of when you put a one of in your deck, like the power that one Evan Carr's Justice has, I feel like it's super high. Like the ceiling on this card, there's no ceiling. We're just outside.
What about the floor?
There's your problem. That's why you don't want to, is because the floor on the second one is just a pit.
I don't know. I still don't think. I think that if you do that, you just have a wildly inconsistent deck that doesn't do any one thing good, and maybe does one thing good in a certain matchup.
You're right.
But
Commander
like, you
sucks.
probably just didn't draw that. I don't know. That's a weird theory. I've never heard anyone say that. The thing I usually hear is, "Oh, if I could just play 25 copies of this spell."
Well, yeah,
That's
of course there's that. Do. Like, of course, if I could play a deck that was just 14 lands and then lightning bolts, I would play the deck and I would have zero fun doing it. But
the 75 card 30, 30 there's like 20
Oh.
Black Lotuses, 25 Black Lotuses, 25 Wheel of Fortunes, some mountains. And it was like 70 cards so that they wouldn't get decked first.
I thought it was 50 Lotuses, 50 Wheel of Fortunes.
Is that what it was?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they need lands in there.
It says
Oh, no, they don't need lands.
It's Black Lotus. Yeah.
Duh. That's probably what the deck was. Yeah.
And that deck is worth more than like countries. Like
I'm not a Magic Matithan or a Magic historian or anything, but didn't that deck like win something and then Wizards realized that not having a restriction on cards is a problem?
Yeah, I think it was like the first ever like competitive something. Yeah, let's stop pissing off all the people who actually know this. But I think that's a really cool idea.
So what about when I want more than 4 copies of a card in my deck, since someone broke the format and Wizards put that restriction on me? What can I do?
You can put redundant copies of a spell in your deck. Yeah, you can't play 4 Lightning Bolt, but you can play something that's kind of like a Lightning Bolt, a Shard Volley or something. And if you really need that effect, go up to 8. And this kind of also encompasses things that aren't like the exact same text on a card. It's like classes of card, like 1-drops.
Or like counterspell and removal spell.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the go-to when I think about these types of things. I think about, my deck wants a lot of counter spells, or my deck wants to be very removal heavy. And so even though the cards aren't fundamentally similar, like, I don't know, there's a huge difference between Disfigure and Doomblade, but at the end of the day, they're removal spells. And so I just want a bunch of removal spell effects in my deck.
So in your opening 7 with 8 in your deck, we're going to skip 5 through 7, and we're just going to say if you put all 8 in your deck, you have a 65% chance to see it in your opener. I actually didn't do the math on what the chance of seeing redundant copies in your opener is, but I would suspect that it's about a third, like a 1 in 3 chance. I've not done that math. But by turn 4, there's an 80% chance of seeing 1, and there's a 40% chance of seeing multiples. So if you put 8 in your deck, the biggest thing I think you're increasing is the chance to see multiples. You've really got to want to see this type of effect over and over and over again, right?
Yeah, like I said with my example about removal spells, like you have to really be a deck that cares about removing creatures. I am a control deck and I need to get to my late game finisher, so I need a bunch of removal spells to not die. That sort of thing.
I think something I like to think about too is the game's not going to go. I'm not just planning for turn 6. I'm planning all the way to the end of the game if I'm a mid-range deck or a control deck. So if I drew every copy of this, which eventually I am, they all have to have a use.
Okay, so now that we've talked about the numbers, and you listeners now know these numbers and they're in your head, and I want to ask Sean, what is the application for this? Like, how does knowing these percentages now play a role in my deck building or my deck brewing?
That is a tough question. There is no perfect number of, is 70% high enough? If I don't win the game, if I just never see this card, maybe it needs to be higher. But you kind of have to make a judgment call, because there's no perfect percentage. There's no certain threshold you want to get it over. You're never going to get to 100% like you'd like. It's a game of probability. It's more of a matter of, I think, testing. Like, that's why I've had debates with people that people who are really, really good at stats don't actually need to play games of Magic to brew a deck. And I think that that's just a logical fallacy of like, well, if you were good enough at stats, you wouldn't have to. Like, maybe that applies to like mana bases or something like that. But I don't even think that's the case
Yeah,
because
I don't even think you
experience.
can apply that to a mana base either, because the way your mana base is designed is all predicated on how your game will play out and what spells are important in the early turns. Like I can look at my mana base and go, here's all my 1-drops, here's all my 2-drops, here's all my 3-drops, whatever. Okay, this is by the numbers the mana base that correlates to that. But like, what
Yeah,
if I
but they're
don't?
doing people who are really, really good at stats are doing things like weighting how much they need this color of mana by X turn
Yeah,
and
but
how
you
much of
can't.
a
Yeah, that's my point. My point is I'm saying you can't do that by not playing games. Like, you need to be able to identify, when do I need this color. Just because this card costs 2 mana doesn't mean I need it on turn 2. This might be a card that I don't necessarily care about casting until turn 4 or 5. And I'm more concerned about making sure I cast my 3-drop, my double colored 3-drop on turn 3 right away. Like, you can't, I don't think that's something you can know without playing games.
well, I mean, I think that they can, and they're
Oh,
like,
I'm sure
oh,
they think they
they can
can.
look through a deck list and be like, well, we don't necessarily need to cast our this 2-drop, and we're going to take that out of our stats we're doing right now, and we're fine with that later, so that's not going to play into this. And I think it's just too much. I feel like
Yeah.
it's an exercise in the impossible, and I think it's kind of like a good way to feel it out. Like, do you feel like 70% is good enough? Is 40% enough of the time that you're like, that feels good that I have a 1-drop 40% of the time? Or are you a deck that is like, okay, well, maybe I don't. Maybe I need to do this way more than that. So it's weird because we have all this data, but we have no perfect way of like,
Yeah. I think it probably also depends a lot on what type of deck you're actually building. I
yeah,
think that, like, I don't know if you've identified a combo that exists, and you're just trying to run the numbers to figure out how consistent you can make your combo. I think that's a little different. Maybe you don't have to do quite as much actual playing of games to figure that out, but I mean, you still have to play the games to find out if your combo is even viable or not. But I don't know. I see that as an example of, I don't actually have to play a game. I can just run the numbers on this, and okay, this is statistically the best way to build this combo deck. But that doesn't necessarily translate into, does that deck work in the format? It doesn't account for their sideboarding tech, the variables that go into their gameplay.
yeah.
And
There's
so in that way, you're still going to have an imperfect deck list, because now you've got to come back to the drawing board and go, well, I lose to XYZ. How do I not?
yeah, like just getting the percentage chance of drawing the tireless tribe combo just means your deck is all cantrips. Okay, well, then you kind of play games and you're like, well, okay, I need some counter spells, put the counter spells in there. And you're like, well, my counter spells don't do it all the time. Ooh, what about Giga Drowse? Because there's something I wasn't considering, and this card is just like a one of that does something so powerful that I just put it in my deck.
I don't know. So the way I kind of think about it in my head is, it's sort of like a wheel or a circle. It just kind of goes around and around. Like, let's start from the brewing. Like, I have a deck idea. I have a combo. I've figured out how to build this combo, and now you're going to go play games, and you're going to identify the problems that this combo deck has in the format, and you're going to come back to your hypergeometric calculator or whatever, and tune your numbers, identify the cards you need to beat those problems that you were encountering, try to figure out what percentage chances you need, play more games, see if that works. I just see it as a constantly revolving, always one leading to the other, one leads into the other. I don't necessarily think you can have one without the other. I don't think that someone can just brew a deck, not consider these numbers and these factors, and then go win a big tournament. I mean, maybe they can, and I don't think that someone could do the inverse, where they just, these are the perfect numbers. I used the hypergeometric calculator to do it, and I'm the smartest person in the world. and this deck is perfect, and then go win a tournament. Like I think that they both just play into each other.
I honestly, I think most people just never use one. It's kind of like one of those things where it's like every once in a while you're curious about something, and so you'll use the calculator. Like it's cool for, I've used it for figuring out, is it worth it to crack this fetch land to thin my deck, or should I just save it in the off chance that I draw a brainstorm or something like that. I've used it for that, but most of the time I don't come back to it that often.
I've certainly never used one.
Yeah, because I think most of the time, just a little explanation at the top of just like, for one, it's when you only want to see one in a game ever. For two, you don't want it in your opener, but you want to see one mid to late game. Like that's good enough most of the time. But every once in a while, I will come back and just like play around with one, and it kind of helps me out. But I think the biggest thing I take away when I look at all of this data together is just how much you're increasing your chance of drawing redundant copies in a game. Like I was looking at my pristine talismans in a deck, and like it's pretty important that I have a source of life gain because my win cons aren't that good, but my removal's really, really good. So I just need a way to gain life. And I was thinking about 4 because I really needed it, and I was like, I don't want it in my opening hand, but I want it a little bit later. So 3 seems okay. And then I started considering too of like, how bad is a redundant copy of this? Of like, if it's super bad, I feel like I would go lower, but I don't mind if I draw 3 of these in a game because they can just fog something until I deal with everything on the field. It's kind of just like guidelines that you think of once, and then when you're designing a deck, you go back and you're like, do these go along with that type of thing? Because yeah, the numbers don't have significance to me. If someone can explain to me the percentage that I'm trying to get a certain thing over, send me an email. But I don't think that there's any perfect percentage for anything.
Yeah, and I also sort of agree that this isn't something that you necessarily need to do every single time you're building a deck. Like kind of how you said, you sometimes come back to it. I do think just knowing these numbers in your head sort of just kind of helps a lot. Like it's probably not super necessary, and it's not something that I would recommend everyone do every single time they build a deck. Have your calculator out and start running numbers, but like I think having at least a knowledge of this, that what these percentages can be, is incredibly helpful in deck building, and I think also in gameplay.
Yeah,
and
that's
just
a good,
sort of,
yeah.
You said it yourself. Like you've been curious, you've watched a game or something, and like, this is a weird decision. I think there was a time we were commentating, and there was a match that the player had like a really hard decision of like, do they crack their fetch land here to try to thin a land to draw an answer, or do they save it for in case they draw a brainstorm? And
they had a Delver in play, and it was
it was a Delver.
They got to peek and
that's right,
shuffle for a second try.
Gotcha. Yeah, so like, yeah, the thought was like, do I crack my fetch land here now, or do I save it until the Delver triggers? Maybe you have a less probable chance of the Delver triggering, but you're also getting 2 looks for your draw step. So like if you absolutely do not want to draw this card on top, even if it does flip the Delver, you can still shuffle it away before your draw step.
Yeah, I think his opponent was at like 3. Mm-hmm. He had an Emrakul in play, and he needed specifically Lightning Bolt. Like flipping Delver didn't matter.
Yeah.
But it was like, well, what do I do? And it's like, it was kind of like a hands down, you just don't crack it, you get 2 looks.
Mm-hmm.
You can also kind of, if you know these percentages, if you have like a super important card and you're like, okay, my opponent's on mono blue, what's the chance that they're going to have days on turn 2? It's about 25. It's about 25%, 1 in 4 games if they have 2 in their deck. But they also kept that hand. So maybe the percentage is way higher, because otherwise they would mulligan maybe. So in real gameplay, the fact that mulligans exist kind of just poops on a lot of your numbers too.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, I would imagine so.
So there's a couple of questions that I've kind of just run down of like, I think we've talked about most of these multiple times, but how early do you want it? Like a more niche spell that you want super early, but you don't want multiples of, might actually bump the numbers up. Are multiples welcome? We've talked about that over and over. The converted mana cost of a card, if it has a lower converted mana cost, you're going to want a higher number of those in your deck, most likely, just to smooth out how the game is going to play so you don't get behind.
And I honestly think that this might be the most important takeaway from what these numbers are, is the 5 to 8 redundant copies number. And that applies to not only like redundant copies of cards with similar effects, but I think you brought it up earlier, it also applies greatly to the CMC of a card and where you want your curve to be. I think that's, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is probably the most important single variable with your deck building, and knowing these numbers in your head is being able to create a consistent mana curve and just being able to do that more effectively. And like, I know that like for a lot of experienced players, or limited players, I know that when I play limited, I can typically suss out what is a good curve in a limited deck. You know, like I've got 4 2-drops, I've got 5 3-drops, 3 4-drops, you know, whatever. But like, I think that if you could sit down and like run the numbers on it, you could obviously just tune that to perfection. You know, if you could understand like what your curve needed to be. And that's where I think that something like this will really play a big factor.
But like, trust your intuition too, because there's certain things your brain is just, it's been bitten by before that numbers don't reflect, that it's going to remember though, and you're going to avoid something like,
it's going to remember like, the time.
The numbers say that I want an Ulamog's Crusher here, but my heart says put in another 2-drop.
Yeah. Like, and your brain is going to remember all those times when you flooded out, you know, you drew 3 spells and 10 lands in a game. Yeah. And you're going to remember that and think like, well, I have 24 lands in this deck. And I remember that time I flooded out, like, should I be playing 23 lands? Like, this is one of those scenarios where I'm just gonna be like, don't follow your heart or your intuition. Yeah. Pull your calculator out, run the numbers, and look at the probabilities.
Yeah.
And I think there's a small problem with that too. Don't look at it and go, man, the percentage chance of me drawing 10 lands, 3 spells in that game was X. I'm so unlucky. Don't look at it that way, because that's not healthy.
I've driven myself insane.
Yeah, it's like the looking at the top card before you mulligan. Dude at F&M the other night did that next to me, and he's a newer player. You know, this was he just started playing, and so, but he goes to mulligan and he looks at his card and he goes, "Dang it, I should have kept it." And I looked at him, I went, "No, you shouldn't have." And he's like, "But this is the card that would have made this hand keepable." And I was like, "Yeah, but it wasn't in your hand." But it was on top of my deck. You don't know that. You can't know that.
I always
can't. I know a lot of people do look, and some people don't look. And honestly, I don't care if you look or don't look. But you can't look and then let that make your mulligan decisions. You know, you can't in the future go, "This is a mulligan, but I remember that one time I looked and my card was on top, so I'm going to keep this bad hand." Yeah. I think these are the same thing. You know, don't run your numbers and go, "Oh, the percentage odds of me drawing this many lands that game was so small. I'm so unlucky." Like,
however, the chance of you drawing your 4 of and all of them in your opening hand it's like less than 1%. So you can feel bad, and the calculator backs you up. I'm just joking, but like, yeah, that don't use the calculator like that. One thing that using one of these calculators really supports is the use of cantrips. Playing 2 cantrips that let you see 3 cards, it takes your chance of seeing your 4 of on turn 4 from 53% to 72%. So you've played 2 1-mana spells and increased your chance of seeing, if you need something specific, say like a removal spell,
Yeah.
20%. And sometimes,
Well, 19, but let's not cut hairs.
yeah, let's not, Brandon. But like, if
That's a lot of percent. Honestly.
If you draw, yeah, it's huge, and that's why Ponder and Preordain are both banned in Modern. Like, you're gonna lose against elves, but you played 2 cantrips, dug 6 cards deeper, and now you have a lightning bolt or your red source or whatever.
Yeah.
The chances of you winning every game just increase a lot because you get to see those specific things you're looking for.
And I think that's again another one of the good things to know for gameplay is if you're in a tight spot, where you're constrained on mana, and like, okay, can I take the risk of spending a mana to cast a cantrip here to find a card in my deck that is going to get me out of it? Or if you have like another safe choice that doesn't necessarily win you the game, but kind of gets you another turn, or you can, draw to the card that's going to win you the game that turn, whatever. Knowing sort of like the math here, even if you don't know it exactly or you can't do the number exactly in your head, but having a rough idea of, I have 3 more copies of this card left in my deck. I've got 40 cards left in my deck. If I cast a cantrip here, like, do I have good odds or not? And just, even if you don't know the exact number, but just being able to know that, like, my odds are roughly this, or that I can draw it, kind of, I think it's good information to have.
I have sat down and been like, this is an interesting play. I don't know the right decision here, and I want to know the chances of XYZ. I've actually like noted the number of cards in my library and the number of cards, like, all of the numbers that I thought would be relevant. Waited until later and then ran the numbers, and I was like, oh, most of the time I'm looking at is it worth it to pop this fetch land? Usually not, if there's any other thing that you could do with it. But that has nothing to do with the number of cards you're putting in your deck. Maybe this is just Hypergeometric Calculator, the episode.
Yeah. I think that we kind of used it as the opportunity to talk about that when, just because we're probably never going to talk about this kind of a topic again. But
oh, never.
Yeah. The main point of this show was card numbers, how many of a certain card to put in your deck. And I think the main takeaways from this are these numbers are kind of interesting to know.
Yeah.
But I don't necessarily think they're the end all be all. A lot of players may never actually know what these exact numbers are. But through play testing and through understanding a format and starting to understand a deck, you can get pretty close to these decisions. But I do think that for sure knowing these is super useful. I don't know. I think personally it's going to make me better I think it's going to make me better at Limited personally. Just kind of having a rough idea of these numbers, especially when like designing curves.
So in Limited, the numbers are different because you don't get access to 4 ofs and your deck is 20 cards smaller, right?
Yeah, and that's why I said that it's going to be more in relation to like my curve and my mana base and stuff like that. Yeah. That's why I said that. Because like obviously like a 4 of is in a 40 card deck, the number is going to be a lot higher.
So the last thing we have here is like you can do this math for categories. Mm-hmm. And I think we touched on it with like removal, creatures, pump spells, cantrips, whatever. I guess you don't brew much, but what do you think is about the normal number of kill spells you want in your deck in a Pauper? Or how many do you want in your deck in Pauper?
I think again it comes down to the context of your deck.
True.
So if I'm playing, I'm trying to remember how many removal spells I have in my blue-black teachings list. So 4 Disfigures, 2 Doom Blades, 2 Agony Warp. That's 8. Evankar's Justice I'll count as 1, so that's 9. And then 2 to 3 copies of Chainer's Edict. So there's like 11, whereas Scred Delver has 7. And
so the most
Boros,
removal heavy deck in the format has 11, right?
Yeah, somewhere around 10 to 11.
If you don't count counter spells.
Yeah, I'm not counting counter spells at all in that argument.
The number I usually start for is like 6.
Yeah, but I think that also depends on what a lot of the rest of your deck can do. A deck like Blue-Black Teachings doesn't have a lot of creatures that can block or interact in combat, and so they need more removal to try to get them to their late game. A deck like Scred Delver is fine with the 7 because they've got creatures that are battling. They've got Augur Abolus that can gum down the board, and they've got Spellstutter Sprite that can counter a creature spell so that you don't need a removal spell and be on the board, to affect the game state that way. And so I think it just completely comes down to the function of your deck. Yeah, if you can interact in combat meaningfully, or your creatures are just generally going to be bigger than theirs, like maybe you don't need to care about the removal quite as much because you know that your creatures can just be an abyss every turn.
I just hate that there's no hard and fast rules, but like Magic is so incredibly diverse that like Elves doesn't have any, whereas other decks require 11 or more. Like I freaking built Corrupt Control that has, I think, like, I don't know,
infinite
34.
The entire deck is removal spells and lands.
Yeah, and like draw spells to get more removal spells.
Yeah.
But yeah, if I'm building like a mid-range, like something that's not incredibly fast and just is like, jam creatures, hope I win, I think 6. Yeah. 6 is my low.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question within the confines of Pauper, I think that removal is more important in this format than some other formats, because there's not a lot of big control decks. A lot of the combo decks are creature-based, and obviously the creature decks are creature-based. So when you get down to it, when you get into a format like Legacy, where you've got your control decks, you've got your combo decks, and then you've got your creature-based decks. And, your combo decks aren't using creatures. They're killing you with Rituals and Tendrils of Agony or whatever. Or they're putting an Emrakul into play, which is technically a creature, but not one that your removal can do anything to, for the most part. Mm-hmm. You need less actual physical removal spells in that format, because you don't want to be in a game where you have 3 fatal pushes in your hand while your opponent is casting Burning Wish. You don't want to be in that world, and so you can play less. And obviously that format also has Brainstorm and Ponder, which we also have, but they make better use of it through their mana base, their fetch lands. So this is one of those things where context of a format becomes incredibly, incredibly important, because you can't just like, okay, I think I want to draw a removal spell 50% of my games. So what's the number on that? And you go to the calculator and you identify the number and you put that many removal spells in your deck. Well, in Pauper, maybe that number's a lot higher. Maybe you want to removal spell 75% of your games.
Yeah.
So that's why you need to just understand your format. And for Pauper, I think that the correct number is probably around 8, depending on what your deck wants to do. I think if you're a control deck and you're not going to be interacting in combat in a meaningful way, you probably want to load up on more. But I think given the way that Pauper is as a format, our combo decks are creature-based. Our creature decks all are creatures. And even our control decks, even our teachings decks are moving into the Gurmag Angler Moldrifter as their win conditions. And so your removal's not even dead in your control matchup. I think overloading on removal initially when brewing in Pauper is probably better than having too few.
Yeah,
I like the idea of having more.
Are not dead.
Yeah, I like the idea of having more removal. Maybe having 8 to 10 copies, and then realizing that maybe I only need 6 or 7. removal spells, and then you can make room for it. I don't know, when it comes to stuff like this, I always think that having more and then taking away is easier than having less and then trying to add. Because if I have 6 removal spells in my deck and find out that I need to have 3 more, I need to go up to 9. I now have to think of 3 cards to cut out of my deck. I just think that would be harder than going, I don't need this many removal spells. Let's trim 1 Doomblade and we'll trim 1 Chainer's Edict. I think that's just a lot easier. And then now you can figure out, like, what do I need, though? Do I need more counter spells? Do I need another threat? I think that's just easier. So I think I would err on the side of more.
Yeah.
Less is not more. More is more. So do more. And then trim your numbers from there as needed.
Okay. Are we ready to wrap it up?
Yeah.
End times.
Welcome to the end times, everybody. That was the Common Knowledge Podcast. The brewing thing.
Couple of brewing guys.
Yeah, no, sort of, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, I honestly enjoy brewing decks. I just don't
like playing them.
I don't usually.
You can't stick.
I don't know. My and this might be a flaw that I have, but I often get too dismissive of an idea. I found that my brewing often comes in the form of metagaming. I think that one of my biggest skills as a Magic player is identifying a metagame and what cards are important and what cards are not. And I know in my past, I think I found that's where I've had the most success in, like, formats like Standard, is taking an existing deck list and then tuning its numbers, or even identifying a deck list that may have fallen out of favor but is coming back into favor. And I feel like the most success I've had has been, like, identifying, the Infect deck looks really good right now in Modern, and no one has that on their radar. I'm going to play Infect at this tournament, or, something like that.
That's my. I think that exact same thing, except about Pauper, where I'm just like, I feel like a deck with 4 Stormbound Geists in the main could just start doing some crazy things.
I think the problem is Stormbound Geist. I don't know. I found that I've cut the number of Stormbound Geists in my Delver decks. I've just found that card has a lot of areas where it just is bad. Like, I would never want to draw Stormbound Geist against Elves or Tireless Tribe or Burn or Heroic or any other of the uninteractive, fast, aggressive decks in this format. But I mean,
isn't that the case for, like, a lot of cards, though?
Yeah, sure. But I don't know what other cards.
Lightning Bolt. I don't know.
I think Lightning Bolt sounds great in, like, every single deck
I know.
that I just named.
Maybe it's just because, like, when it's good, it's so amazing, but when it's bad, it's like just a 3-mana flyer.
It's a 3-mana 2/2. In any scenario that's not, I need my creatures to be resilient to removal, or I need my creatures to be better in combat. And there's so many decks in this format that don't care about either of those things. You could have the most resilient creature on the planet. You could have True Name Nemesis. And Tireless Tribe don't give a dang.
So
They're just going to shatter
your deck.
Up their creature.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and that's why I think Stormbound Geists are in sideboards.
Yeah.
Is because they're terrible when they're terrible, but they're amazing when they're amazing.
See, it's my whole philosophy of just, like, if you just put a few cards in your deck that, like, this one just gives me 100% win rate against this deck, and this one does it for that deck, like, put a Swirling Sandstorm in there, some Stormbound Geists.
Yeah, but then you're, like, left with the, I drew my one of Stormbound Geist. I really wish I drew my one of Swirling Sandstorm against Elves, and I didn't.
No, just put, like, 3 of those cards in. 3 Swirling Sandstorms. I know.
But now I'm playing against the Blue-Black Teachings deck, and I really
You don't have to tell me it's a bad idea, Brandon. No, it's a bad idea. I just want to.
You know what, Sean?
Huh.
You should play Brawl. That's a singleton format that's 60 cards.
That's not Pauper.
All right, we're going to do the outro for real now. Sponsors. We have them. We want you to check them out because they're great. PureMTGO.com. They have all awesome articles and deck lists and podcasts and all the good stuff there. InkGaming.com. We have a sweet coupon code, CCMTG10. It's going to give you a 10% payout, or not payout, 10% off of your purchase at checkout. So they've got a bunch of really cool stuff. Honestly, I had never looked or I think even heard of them. Like, I think I might have heard of them, but I don't know that I've ever seen any of their stuff until we got this coupon code. And, you know, Spencer was like, use this tell people about this code now. And then I actually went to their website and looked at their stuff, and they've got some actually really cool stuff. Like,
yeah, they do.
I like their playmat. You know, I like very simple designs. I don't know if you've noticed this about me, but you'll never see me wearing a t-shirt with crazy designs or a lot of stuff going on. You know, my t-shirts are always very plain. And it's just because I like that stuff. I like a playmat that's just a black playmat that says Ink Gaming on it in red cursive letters. So check out those guys. Use that coupon code CCMTG10. Get 10% off your order. So lastly, but certainly not leastly, Sean, where can the listeners find you if they want to ask you questions?
Suggest show topics?
Suggest show topics.
You can find me on Twitter if you look for Lobbert8. That's Lobbert, then the number 8. And you can also find me on YouTube if you just search for Lobbert. Where can they find you, Brandon?
You can find me on Twitter at bclark_ck. That's where I'll be the most active in regards to just Magic type of stuff. You also find me and Sean hanging around the CK Podcast Facebook page. I think it's just Common Knowledge Podcast or something is what the group is called.
Just look for Common Knowledge, and
there's always some good discussion going on there too. And, you know, Sean and I try to participate in the conversation and
card discussions, deck discussions if you want it. And one thing that is his name, Luke G.
Mm-hmm.
He just posts screenshots of cool parts of his games, and I love that. That's sweet.
Yeah,
it's one of my favorite things.
Yep. Cool. Oh, I forgot. Give us your monies on Patreon. Almost forgot to plug that in there, but we do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/common knowledge. And right now we're trying to get to our first stretch goal, which is $50. And when we hit that stretch goal, we will be sponsoring a 5-card blind tournament. I think we've decided what our prize is going to be. I don't know if we want to wait to announce that until we're a little more sure.
I'm sure.
You're sure? Okay. So what we're going to be doing for our 5-card blind tournament is we're going to be giving away coupon codes or voucher codes with a redeemable amount of store credit that can be redeemed through puremtgo.com.
Yeah, this ain't no coupon code. You don't have to pay any money. Like, oh, you get 10% off.
Coupon code is the wrong word.
We're just giving you like $20 to spend on Magic Online.
Yeah, it's just a certain amount of store credit. That code is redeemable for that amount of store credit. We don't have the numbers fleshed out yet. You know what first place is going to be, or even how deep we're going to go. If we're going to just top 4, top 8, or what. But that's what we're going to do. So we're going to be doing some store credit code giveaways for the 5-card blind tournament. If you're a new listener and you're unsure about what that is, you can go to our actual Patreon page and you can just see we have the rules for that there, and you can figure out what it is, what the rules are, how it works. And while you're there, you also get to check out Sean's sweet spreadsheet. Not spreadsheet, your graph that has all of our power rankings from the past 6 months.
And if you're a patron, you can see our Lobbert versus Brandon videos. I am in the middle of putting all of them into one nice playlist, and you're not going to have to dig through, and we'll just send you notifications when we update that playlist. So that will be there for you to enjoy, and it's going to be a lot more streamlined so we can upload more of those more frequently.
Yeah, and I actually have a goal for myself that I'm going to try to learn how to use an editing software so I can actually help Sean with that. And at that point, my goal is to have those new videos every week. That is my goal when I figure that out.
Wow. Yeah, it's been like a month.
Yeah, and that's no fault of Sean. He edits our show every single week. So say thank you to him, because I certainly don't.
Bye.
Bye.